American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
How do you get a weed-free lawn? A healthy garden? A home that's pest-free? Every day we work to find new and better solutions. Ortho, proud to support the American Experience on PBS.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Washington, Christmas 1963. 5 weeks after the assassination of President Kennedy, the new president spoke of the nation's losses and hopes.
We buried Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy, but we did not bury their dreams or their visions. They are our dreams and our visions today. So let us here on this Christmas night determine that John Kennedy did not live or die in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward all men.
Three months before President Kennedy's death, Martin Luther King Jr. had focused national concern on civil rights with an impassioned call for racial harmony.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
I'm about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
President Johnson's liberal domestic policies dominated the news and eclipsed Vietnam. But the political consensus he built around civil rights and other great society programs was soon threatened by the war.
In 1964 and early 1965, the country was going along with the president. The arguments were being made increasingly to the country and through the media that Vietnam was important, that the United States had a commitment there, that something would have to be done.
United States Marines head for security duty in South Vietnam. Their landing is at a beach north of Da Nang, where they will guard the American jet airfield against attack by Viet Cong guerrillas and infiltrators from North Vietnam, only 80 miles away.
And I remember having in my mind the thought that, my God, I hope Johnson is right. I hope we're not getting into something here that the country can't handle.
If tomorrow they tell you it's a blessed murder and to declare war then there's only one thing to do. Say no. You pirate. Treason! 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 We shall live in peace.
Opponents and supporters of the war clashed early in the Johnson administration. At first, the anti-war groups were small and little noticed. They included civil rights activists, members of Old Left and women's organizations, pacifists, students, and clergymen.
We shall overcome someday.
So the clergy found themselves in a very difficult dilemma. Catholic bishops were very anti-communist, so it's very hard to find a Catholic bishop who would say, I am anti-communist, but I think this war is evil. Rabbis were very afraid that if they opposed Johnson on the war in Vietnam, Johnson would not support them on Israel. So all these things were very much in the picture when it came to the clergy.
What is the purpose of your groups picketing the White House, Reverend Newhouse?
Clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam are here today holding a silent vigil, we like to think, rather than a picket, in order simply to express a cry of anguish about what we believe to be an immoral and a self-defeating course which our country finds itself increasingly bogged down in Vietnam.
You're being effectively counter-picketed by an almost equal number of people. Reverend Reynolds, what is the difference in the opinion of your group and that one across the street?
Well, about as much difference as day and night. They believe the war in Vietnam is immoral and inhuman, and we believe it's essential to defend our freedom and to keep our word and our commitments made to the South Vietnamese. It's immoral to keep our boys over there in a battle where they're suffering and dying if we're not going to win.
Despite increasing draft calls, college students could avoid military service if they remained in school.
Well, I don't want to go to Vietnam because I don't want to get killed. If I have to, I will.
Student attendance at Vietnam teach-ins was growing.
I think we should stop letting President Johnson fight an armchair war from the White House and turn it over to our generals in Vietnam who know how to fight a war.
As far as I remember American history, it's been a traditional principle that civilians exercise control over the military, that we never turn into a warfare state in which generals have completely free hand.
You are not afraid of the communist menace, I'll put that in quotes if you like. However, I am. In 50 short years, the communists who started with 17 followers have enslaved 40% of the Earth's people and 25% of the Earth's land mass. This is more than Christianity can count standing after nearly 2,000, and you tell us there's nothing to worry about? How can you stand there, insult the intelligence of these students, feeding them?
My apologies.
Blacks were joining the military amid sharpening debate.
When they get up on television and Lyndon Baines Johnson talk all that garbage about he's sending boys over there to fight for the rights of colored people, you ought to know that's a lie, because we live here with them and they don't ever do a thing for us.
As the caskets begin to come home, people begin to reevaluate. And the very fact that there were a disproportionate number of blacks in Vietnam meant that very early a disproportionate number of caskets began to come back to the black community. At that point, they began to reevaluate.
Despite feeble protestations to the contrary, the promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam. The pursuit of this widened war has narrowed the promised dimensions of the domestic welfare programs, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
As the war dragged on into 1967, street rhetoric grew rougher.
How much time have you spent there, Martha?
In Vietnam?
Yes.
14 months.
14 months?
Yes, sir.
Are you disturbed about the demonstrations like we had a month or so ago against our...
I just don't pay any attention to them anymore. We got too many good Americans.
99% of the people in this country are terrific Americans and disagree entirely with flag burnings, carrying enemy colors, giving medical supplies to the enemy, etc.
A few congressmen, led by Senator Fulbright, now question Johnson's right to wage war without a declaration of war.
Would the president, if there was no resolution, be with or without constitutional authority to send U.S. soldiers to South Vietnam in the numbers that are there today, if there were no resolution?
It would be my view, as I indicated, Mr. Chairman, that he does have that authority.
That's a difficult doctrine for me to agree to, that the Congress cannot control the President of the United States from the standpoint of the use or the withholding of the troops of this country abroad. I simply can't go along with that doctrine.
But didn't that resolution authorize the President to use the armed forces of the United States in whatever way was necessary? Didn't it?
Well,
what could a declaration of war have done? That would have given the President more authority and a clearer voice of the Congress of the United States than that did.
Well, it was not the country's decision to land combat troops in Vietnam. The country hasn't made that decision. The President has made that decision.
The administration stood firm, and Congress continued to vote money for the war. Troop levels continued to rise. Though some men fled the country to avoid service, most complied with the draft. Some who opposed conscription on grounds of conscience burned their draft cards. Some joined an anti-draft organization called the Resistance.
The Resistance was founded in an attempt to organize explicit public non-cooperation with conscription through the action of returning draft cards to the government. Very simple, open, public declarations that we would not cooperate, and if the government intended to enforce the Selective Service Act, then it was going to have to send us to jail. Well, October 16th had been the date that we had set when we first started the resistance for the first national draft card return, during which all around the country, and as it turned out in 18 different cities, there would be demonstrations at which young people would collect draft cards and give them to the federal government. And in San Francisco, which was one of the two largest demonstrations on that date in the country, 2,000 of us gathered on the steps of the federal building in San Francisco.
And that if it takes our lives to change this country, then that's what's going to happen.
And then we got this basket and announced on the bullhorn, okay, the time had come, and out goes the basket. There's this scene of all these hands coming up holding draft cards, dropping them into the basket, and the basket circulates through the crowd and comes back up to the front. We sort of look at it and get ready to go inside, and then all of a sudden from the back of the crowd, these shouts start coming, more, back here, we want it, send the basket. It was an attempt to call the question on the rest of the anti-war movement, to say put up or shut up, no more of this screaming against the war and then coming home and making sure you have your student deferment in your pocket. If you were going to be against the war, then put your body where your mouth was.
So we coined a slogan from protest to resistance, which was that you'd keep marching and rallying, but that we would step up the pace of nonviolent civil disobedience.
The new tactics were tested in the March on the Pentagon, October 1967.
It is clear from the evidence that I have that this is a part of a move by the communists, especially of North Vietnamese government, to divide the American people, disrupt our war effort, discredit our government for the entire world. The leaders of North Vietnam consider the march on the Pentagon tomorrow as much of their war effort as the guerrilla warfare in South Vietnam and the North Vietnamese army assaulting our troops on the battlefield. Those who participate in these demonstrations tomorrow will be, in effect, cooperating with and assisting our enemy.
God bless America! God bless America!
There is no freedom in a land where fear and hate prevail. Isn't this our time? Isn't this our time? A time to try the soul of men. Isn't this a terrible time?
I want to ask you what has happened to a country whose political objectives must be secured at the end of a bayonet.
More than 55,000 demonstrated. united in opposition to the draft and the war, but divided on many other issues. The protesters, who were mainly students, faced other young Americans who were already in uniform. Most protested peacefully, but 5,000 rushed the Pentagon, some taunting and cursing the troops. More than 600 were arrested during the march.
Take them on back, lock them up.
The demonstration had no impact on policy, but it outraged some officials, including the head of Selective Service.
To me, a demonstration is some legal thing that you engage in under your rights to let people know how you feel about things. Now, whenever we get to a place where the demonstration, more than accidentally, interferes with our operation, I don't think there's any question about it, ceased to be a demonstration and became a violation of the law.
I don't recall, since I've been here, as strong a division of opinion as to the wisdom of a policy as now exists with regard to the Vietnamese War. That's true, I believe, in the committee. I think from the reports in the newspapers and magazines that exists in the country.
The economy was turning sour and turning some businessmen against the war. Johnson discussed his decision to raise taxes with a group of federal home loan officers.
I know it's not a popular thing for a president to do, to ask anyone for a penny out of a dollar to pay for a war that's not popular either.
By late 1967, for the first time, a poll showed that a majority of Americans considered the war a mistake.
We know that most people's intentions are good. We don't question their motives. We've never said they're unpatriotic, although they say some pretty ugly things about us. We believe very strongly in preserving the right to differ in this country and the right to dissent. And if I have done a good job of anything since I've been president, is to ensure that there are plenty of dissenters.
In 1967, it's reasonable to say that most people who were concerned to try and create a political alternative to Lyndon Johnson because of the war in Vietnam didn't much care who the presidential candidate was, as long as it was somebody who had a chance of winning.
Early in 1968, voters, shocked by a massive enemy offensive in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, were courted by presidential challenger Eugene McCarthy.
I've been saying I intended to stop the war, and I've been, I think, explaining how, by proceeding to negotiate a coalition government, or at least to be prepared to accept a coalition government. But both the President and Mr. Nixon are talking about ending the war, but they're not saying when or how or at what cost, and I think that's the issue in the New Hampshire primary.
Senator McCarthy's strong showing in New Hampshire encouraged another candidate, Senator Robert Kennedy, brother of the late president. His campaign got an early lift from President Johnson's surprise announcement that he would not run for re-election.
But I need your help. I need your assistance. So over the period of the next 30 days, will you help me? Will you tell your friends? Yeah! Will you whisper it or will you yell it?
War critics Kennedy and McCarthy dominated the Democratic primaries. Under FBI surveillance and troubled by rising violence in the anti-war and civil rights movements, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in Memphis and foreshadowed his own death.
We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
King's assassination the next day rocked the nation and sparked riots in more than 100 cities. Black Power militancy increased. Unlike most political leaders, Kennedy had sympathized with King's opposition to the war.
Senator Kennedy, would you comment on the death of Dr. King?
I wrote out some words. I think he dedicated himself to justice and love between his fellow human beings. He gave his life for that principle, and I think it's up to those of us who are here, his fellow citizens and public officials, those of us in government, to carry out that dream, to try to end the divisions that exist so deeply within our country and remove the stain of bloodshed from our land.
Opposed to both Kennedy and McCarthy, Johnson picked Vice President Hubert Humphrey as his heir apparent.
We've had some very severe blows lately, and we've got to try to bind up these wounds. And if this means, quite frankly, if it means that I don't have the time for campaigning like an ordinary candidate, that's the way it'll have to be.
Over the next 2 months, Kennedy and McCarthy continued their rivalry in the Democratic primaries. The contest reached a climax in California. Kennedy won. His assassin was waiting.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
McCarthy's campaign workers were watching reports of Kennedy's victory celebration.
They don't know who's been
As we get more definite details, we'll bring them to you.
If you do not leave the room, we cannot get medical aid to the senator. Now, would you please stand and cause confusion? What? Kennedy has been shot. To help get medical aid to the senator, please leave the room.
Let me,
Somebody stop Robert Kennedy. They're trying
This is Drinkwater.
Please, we need you immediately.
You were there, you saw what happened. Yes, I did. What happened? I'm sorry, I can't make any comments.
To many, Kennedy's assassination 2 months after King's seemed confirmation that the country was on the verge of chaos. Then came Chicago. Torn by strikes and braced for violence, Mayor Daley's city welcomed the divided delegates to the 1968 Democratic Convention. Relations between the police and the press corps were tense. Vice President Humphrey, choice of the party regulars, was assured of the nomination before he arrived. But Humphrey and the Johnson administration were still targets of McCarthy's muted attacks.
I think the case is rather clear as to what's wrong about our involvement in Vietnam, and I think the case is rather clear as to what we ought to be doing about our problems here at home. It calls for some quiet and some restraint, a kind of backing off for a minute to look at America and to consider what we ought to be doing. And the nation has done that, and with your help and the help of others in these next 3 days, I believe that the Democratic Convention will do the same here in Chicago. Thank you very much.
Others had a different purpose.
Our position is that whoever the candidates are, and whatever the platforms, that we must stay in the streets and stay in active resistance, or else there will be no peace, either in the ghettos or in Vietnam.
We don't know.
Do you have a permit to march any in particular?
No.
But you're going to march any?
Are you expecting trouble? We expect to march. We expect trouble all the time.
Thousands of highly visible protesters descended upon Chicago. Militants, pacifists, and hippies, with 500 undercover agents among them.
Our property, which facing. If you do not leave, you will be subject to arrest.
Some demonstrators were nonviolent. Others deliberately provoked the police.
These people are revolutionaries bent on the destruction of the government of the United States of America. They're a pitiful handful. They have almost no support, but by golly, they get the cooperation of the news media. They're built into something really big. Gentlemen, the hardcore leadership of this group are communist.
I told my partner, I says, grab your club and jump out swinging before they tip us, because we'd sooner fight than roast. So we jumped out. Well, I should say I jumped out first, and he stayed in the wagon and called for help. When we got out, I grabbed one. I hit another one down. And then somebody grabbed me from the rear and flung me into the crowd, and these dirty hippie son of a so-and-sos, they called me a mother-hunching so-and-so and a white fascist. And they said, you're getting some of your own medicine. And then some citizen, I don't know who he was, but I wish I could find out, he stopped his car and jumped out with a little pinch bar. And he started helping us. Otherwise, I think they'd either killed me or crippled me more than what I am.
Amid the violence, talk of peace.
6 months ago in Vietnam, the only alternative before us was force or withdrawal. And I think that withdrawal would be totally unrealistic and would be a catastrophe. The second alternative, which I now speak of, is the conference in Paris. The negotiations are underway. They're not making a great deal of progress, but they are underway. Now, we've been seeking to get those negotiations for years. The roadblock to peace, my dear friend, is not in Washington, D.C., it is in Hanoi, and we ought to recognize it as such.
Over 4 days and nights, sporadic battles in the streets were echoed by angry debates on the war inside the convention hall.
It is altogether too late here for us to begin to discuss the merits of the war in Vietnam. That question has been presented to 7 million Democrats across this nation. That question was presented in the states where there are primaries, and the people have found an indictment of that war.
Most delegates to this convention do not know that thousands of young people are being beaten in the streets of Chicago.
Wisconsin is not recognized for that purpose.
The interesting thing was that the size of the protest against the war became so large that it was impossible to avoid it as a news story. A lot of people say we were manipulated by that. I don't think so. We had learned to avoid manipulation, and we were simply responding to masses and masses of people. If you think of the 1968 Democratic Convention and the fighting on Michigan Avenue in Chicago between hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of demonstrators, it was a story of inescapable news value. It had to be covered.
The demonstrators were trying to march on the convention hall without a police permit. Blocked, they sat down in the street.
I've never seen anything as horrible in my whole life. Look at Dr. Keller.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. The victory is ours. The victory is ours. The victory is ours. Get in, lady.
remember Walter Mears of the Associated Press writing a lead the night that Hubert Humphrey received the Democratic nomination at that convention, and he wrote something like, Hubert Humphrey, a man of peace, received the Democratic nomination tonight under armed guard.
It would have been impossible to hold the Democratic National Convention in any city in the United States or throughout the world without demonstrations or disruption. Daley's right on this point. Chicago just happened to be the city. It would have been impossible to hold it anywhere because the Democratic Party has blood on its hands. And because there's a struggle going on in the world today between young people and between those old menopausal men who run this country. And it's a struggle about what the future of this country is about.
Well, Chicago was a sort of sad time because if you've been involved in the politics and the process of talking to people and going out and talking door to door, what was quite clear was that a great many of the American people, in fact, were sympathetic to the anti-war movement. And yet suddenly the image that they got was not of this nice young person coming to their door and saying, wouldn't you like to vote for Gene McCarthy? But of people shouting obscenities and disrupting the city.
But it weakened the anti-war movement around the edges, at least. And that became, the edges became what Richard Nixon played on.
The Republican candidate delivered a familiar campaign message to Chicagoans a week after the Democrats went home.
My friends, let me make one thing clear. This is a nation of laws, and as Abraham Lincoln has said, no one is above the law, no one is below the law, and we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law and order.
Handicapped by his support of Johnson's war policies, Humphrey had trouble taking the offensive.
I believe the Republican candidate owes it to the people to come out of the shadows. Would you mind bringing your television camera down here? You fellows do an awful lot to promote that with that camera. Now, come on down here, will you? Knock it off, will you, please?
While Humphrey tried to separate himself from Johnson, Nixon lumped them together in attacks on the administration's record.
Let me tell you what those 4 years have done to America. The longest war that America's ever had in its history. The worst crime wave we've ever had in our history. The highest taxes we've ever had in our history. The highest rate in the cost of living that we've had in a generation. And the lowest respect for the United States of America in our history.
Let America know that we can't be taken for granted. We're going to have the biggest election surprise that America's known in 20 years. We're going to win this election. Thank you very much.
It was not to be. Humphrey's campaign took off when he called for a U.S. peace initiative, and it accelerated when Johnson declared a bombing halt. But Nixon, promising to end the war with honor, won by a slender margin.
Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
The honeymoon period, traditionally granted a new president, was charged with the expectation that Nixon would unveil a plan to end the war. But during the first 6 months of 1969, U.S. casualties were high. Life magazine published portraits of GIs killed in a single week. And week after week, every Thursday night, network news viewers saw the body counts.
I entered government with the conviction that one could create a large consensus behind a reasonable program, which would then impress Hanoi with our determination to be both conciliatory, but also to indicate the limits of our conciliatoriness. That objective we never achieved because the moderate groups always felt they had to be a step ahead of the administration.
This protest is directed not toward the young men, American or Vietnamese, who have fought and died.
The notion of the moratorium was a pretty straightforward one, which was that we had to take the anti-war movement off the campus and build it back into the community. That meant you had to have language that was moderate and not strident and and off-putting, that you had to have people, events which moderate people could participate in. It had to be locally organized so that people knew the people who were organizing it. And sort of heartland folks had to feel that it belonged to them.
It's going to be a wake of death. There are millions of government officials in all these little towns that support the United States.
But the problem is, most of South Vietnam support the Viet Cong.
In Washington, the moratorium drew 50,000. Over 1 million participated nationwide. North Vietnam's Premier Pham Van Dong sent a message of friendship to the organizers.
Now, this message from a communist regime in North Vietnam is a shocking intrusion into the affairs of the American people by an enemy power. I think that the leaders of the demonstrations are chargeable with the knowledge of this communication and responsible to the extent that they must make perfectly clear what these demonstrations are for.
The moratorium ended with candlelight ceremonies in Washington and elsewhere.
All I wanted to say was that I am for peace, that I'm not exactly sure how it should come about, but I'm saying that because I want peace, I'm standing here, I'm marching, I'm holding my candle.
What the protesters did not know, could not know, and what most others did not know, was that for months Nixon had been privately warning Hanoi that November 1st was their deadline. That is the first anniversary of the Johnson bombing halt, which had produced nothing from North Vietnam. That unless they were ready to negotiate seriously and showed us that they were by November 1st, they would bear some very heavy unstated consequences, with the implication that these would be military. Now, Hanoi was a diligent reader of U.S. public opinion and of U.S. demonstrations. Nixon was very worried that the October 15th moratorium, just 2 weeks before this deadline that he had privately given Hanoi, would be seen by them as evidence that he could not deliver.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
The majority of the population, on the whole, supported the administration. So there was a conflict, strangely enough, between what the elite was thinking and what the general public was thinking. It was not that the anti-war movement ever achieved a majority, but when 30% of the population and many of those who write for the media and speak publicly oppose a given cause, confusion is inevitable.
Though Nixon had started major troop withdrawals from Vietnam, mid-November brought another larger protest to Washington called the mobilization. Vice President Agnew took a tough line.
The American who relies upon television for his news might conclude that the majority of American students are embittered radicals, that the majority of black Americans feel no regard for their country.
1, 2, 3, 4, Ricky Dick, stop the war.
That violence and lawlessness are the rule rather than the exception on the American campus. We know that none of these conclusions is true. Perhaps the place to start looking for a credibility gap is not in the offices of the government in Washington, but in the studios of the networks in New York.
Now, after the Agnew attack, I'm a pretty careful reader of the newspapers, and I was then a contributing editor of the Huntley-Brinkley Report. I used to go around saying to people, when they would say, well, what's your reaction to Agnew? I would say, well, a good journalist, when he gets into a serious subject, always thinks twice before using certain words. And I said then, and I believe now that we were thinking thrice.
Members of the press, just so you know now, all these people are going to form out on the sidewalk, and they'll stand there for a number of minutes for you to take pictures if you want to ask questions. They'll then proceed very slowly across the bridge for more pictures and questions. On the other side of the bridge, they will not speak to you. Thank you.
How many marches and demonstrations would we have if the marchers did not know that the ever-faithful TV cameras would be there to record their antics for the next news?
Amid arguments whether peace protests lengthened or shortened the war in Vietnam, the war in America was a continuing story. After the mobilization, another shock. Life published pictures of Vietnamese peasants massacred in 1968 by U.S. soldiers in a village called My Lai. The trials of Lieutenant William Calley and others implicated in the My Lai massacre haunted the news for months. Only Calley was convicted in a swirl of controversy. Was he scapegoat or war criminal? Was the massacre an isolated case or a common occurrence? Had draft inequities hurt the morale of the Army? The Nixon administration reduced draft calls and instituted a lottery, which was meant to be more fair and more predictable.
April 24th.
Men whose birth dates came up with low numbers knew that they would soon hear from their draft boards.
April 24 is 002.
I was coming back into Boston. I heard that my birth date, August 2nd, had come up as number 45 on the draft list, and suddenly I realized this was something that I had to figure out what to do about, as I had not really thought I would have to.
003.
The course that I ended up choosing, and that was again in the spirit of those times, was to look for the painless way out, namely a physical deferment. And with a combination of just generalized anxiety and with a determination to get out, I lost about 10 pounds over the next few months.
Helped by a sympathetic doctor, Fallows succeeded in failing his physical.
Near the end of the induction day, as the people from Cambridge were getting ready to go back into their new lives, the buses started arriving from a white working class district of Boston. And while 9 out of 10 of my comrades from Harvard and MIT were getting out with their doctor's excuses, the same proportion of people from this part of town were marching right through the physical and were going off to the military, going off to the war. Nobody could avoid recognizing what that meant then. We knew that while we were not going to war, we were seeing the people who were. We were seeing the people who were going to be killed.
The military command post just across this road is outside the town of Godaha, only a few miles from the Cambodian border. As best we can tell, this is the South Vietnamese command post for the operation into the Cambodian Parrot's Beak. But the strictest kind of security is being enforced here, even to the point where the one American advisor we've seen warned us not to ask questions.
The same night this story was broadcast on the evening news, President Nixon went on television to announce that he was sending American troops into Cambodia to fight the Vietnamese communists.
If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world. It is not our power, but our will and character that is being tested tonight. The question all Americans must ask and answer tonight is this: does the richest and strongest nation in the history of the world have the character to meet a direct challenge by a group which rejects every effort to win a just peace, ignores our warning, tramples on solemn agreements, violates the neutrality of an unarmed people, and uses our prisoners as hostages?
I don't think he meant it to have an inflammatory effect, but it did. And it sent the country into a spasm of hysteria, which then was greatly exacerbated a few days later when 4 students were killed at Kent State.
A lot of our taxes goes to support just what you're doing today. I wish you'd get out and get a job and work.
We'd like to wait. I'm from upstate New York, and I'd like to turn in my Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. I lost my leg in Vietnam, and I'm totally opposed to this war we're carrying on over there. And Senator Buckley and Congressman James Hanley will receive my medals next week in the mail. Thank you.
One by one, decorated veterans flung away their medals on the steps of the Capitol. The American war was winding down. GI casualties were decreasing. But those veterans who opposed the war were asking for something more than an end to hostilities.
We wish that a merciful God could wipe away our own memories of that service, as easily as this administration has wiped their memories of us. And so, when 30 years from now our brothers go down the street without a leg, without an arm, or a face, and small boys ask why, we will be able to say Vietnam, and not mean a desert, not a filthy, obscene memory, but mean instead the place where America finally turned, and where soldiers like us helped it in the turning.
Across America, thousands of families by now were visiting the grave sites of their children killed in Vietnam. And millions of Americans were sharing their losses.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Eternal rest be unto him, O Lord. May his soul rest in peace. May the soul of the faithfully departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Amen.
American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Major funding for this program was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
We are PBS.